One of the most beautiful and peaceful places you could ever choose to play golf is at Abbeydale. Not least amongst its many attractions is the club's history, which is a long and fascinating one. During this presentation about its past, there are so many decades to cover and so many stories to tell. It's impossible to fit everything in. Most of the time it's been a very successful club, but there have been many difficult moments too. But we'll touch on those later. Thankfully, through the ages, there have been generation after generation of outstanding members. From these has emerged a succession of inspired leaders. And it's all these members, men and women, whose passion for the club has carried it through to where we are now. Our story must start way back in the 1890s. That's long before the World Wide Web, long before television, and so many other things we take for granted now. As you can see from these pictures of central Sheffield, even the motor car was still a few years away. Meanwhile, many miles away, Lindrick Common was the location of the first and only golf course in our region, having been established in 1891. Despite its proximity to Worksop, it was named the Sheffield and District Golf Club. Sheffield because that's where the majority of members lived and ran their businesses. Perhaps confirmation that in the early days golf was mostly for the wealthy. Actually getting to Lindrick and then back home again was the biggest difficulty for the majority of players. Their usual mode of transport for most of the way was by train. They went from Sheffield, Victoria to the little station at Shire Oaks. From there, the golfers and their kit were picked up by a horse-drawn wagonette and then taken to the course. This often meant that golf could take up the whole day, especially when you factor in a break for food and the tiring journey home. It was inevitable that a new course would have to be developed nearer to Sheffield, both to cut down the travelling time and to satisfy demand. For many middle-class families, finance for leisure activities wasn't going to be a problem. Trade and industry were booming in the mid-1890s. Both locally and countrywide, there was a significant move towards golf. It was against this background of confidence and optimism that a group of Lindrick members, who lived in the villages to the south of Sheffield, called a meeting to judge the depth of support for a new and a more local course. An expectant crowd met at the Devonshire Arms in due course, and dozens of people attended, including several ladies. Enthusiasm for the proposition clearly shone through, because it was on that very night that Dore Golf Club was instituted, the 9th of July 1895. It's now time that we met this important man, William Milner, who was elected president that night to take things forward. A good golfer and well-respected gentleman of private means, William was one of the leading motivators behind the new scheme. Mr. Milner had also helped to establish the course and the club at Lindrick Common 4 years earlier, so his legal and practical knowledge were invaluable. He'd also been captain there. It's his connection with the two projects which makes him very important to the history of the new local club. In modern parlance, we could perhaps call him a velvet bulldozer, powerful yet soft and smooth, but always getting a result. Without his influence and connections, there might never have been an Abbeydale golf club. So, should you happen to be near the churchyard at Holmesfield, it's this man you should acknowledge, perhaps with a grateful nod as you pass by. Just as soon as arrangements could be made, there was a 9-hole course of sorts on rented land at nearby Rycroft Farm, indoor. The farmer's dining room was used as a makeshift clubhouse. The Golfing Annual, a national publication, besides describing briefly the features of the course, states that there were 61 members in the first year, the men paying a subscription of 1 guinea and the ladies a half of that. Many of the well-known gentlemen who helped to establish the new Door Golf Club were also members at Lindrick, and so had a foot in each camp. Undoubtedly, they welcomed the shorter journey from their homes near Rycroft Farm for a quick 9 holes. Indeed, some famous Sheffield names were officials at each club at one time or another. Confirmation, if needed, that Abbeydale was a progeny, an offshoot of Lindrick. Also connected were the Doncaster family, famous throughout the world for the steel which they manufactured. Nora Doncaster in particular was a prominent supporter of Abbeydale ladies section. She was a very accomplished golfer, playing many times in the Yorkshire County team. Now back to Rycroft Farm. Unfortunately, no sooner had things settled when there was a bolt from the blue. A notice to quit was delivered to the secretary. Sadly, the tenancy of the farmhouse and its land was due to change. The golfers would have to find somewhere else to play. But Mr. Milner and his colleagues acted quickly to find a more suitable and hopefully a more permanent location. The club called upon Sandy Hurd, a Scottish professional golfer with a growing reputation. He was based at Huddersfield Golf Club. He was engaged to search for suitable golfing land in Derbyshire, but within easy reach of Sheffield. Note that in those days the Derbyshire border went much further north than it does today. After investigating various sites, Sandy recommended an area sufficient for 9 holes on the spacious Beechief estate. After a lease was agreed and signed to rent 45 acres, the Scotsman designed a layout which still sets a stiff challenge even today. It's worth staying a moment with Sandy Hurd. Like all the pros from that era, he was an all-rounder. As well as playing in tournaments and exhibition matches, he served in the shop. As was normal then, he also made clubs and even balls. On the tee, he was an ardent advocate of the waggle as part of the pre-shot routine. But sometimes the length of time spent over this would infuriate his playing partners. Despite this eccentricity, Sandy is still thought of with affection as one of the best pros of that time, and went on to win the Open Championship at Hoylake in 1902, thanks in part to the new long-distance Haskell ball. His prize was the sum of £30. Sandy Herd's choice of Beecheth Estate turned out to be ideal for the club, being served by a railway station, a main road and, importantly, a hostelry, namely the Abbeydale Hotel. These were momentous days for our golf club, a huge and expensive leap for what was still a fledgling organisation. Along with a change of location, here to Beechief, came a change of name. It was now 1897, and in order to broaden the appeal to a wider public, we became Abbeydale Golf Club. Within the grounds which the club rented are the remains of the 12th century Beechief Abbey and its later tower. Along with many monasteries throughout the country, the structure was partially demolished on the orders of Henry VIII. Even though we're no longer at that location, the club is still proud to use an image of the tower for its logo. Back to golf and to Dr. Lewis Husband, Abbeydale's very first captain. He held that office between 3 and 4 years. Later he took on the chairmanship of both the Sheffield and the Yorkshire Unions. Dr. Husband was one of the cornerstones of the golf club throughout his career. Despite playing off a very low handicap, he held the course record a number of times, including after 1912 when the course was extended to 18 holes. And here's the stylish trophy which he donated and which is still played for today, almost 120 years later. Dr. Husband decreed that the competition was exclusively for shopkeeping members. Furthermore, it should always be played for on a Thursday, which was their half-day off. A very considerate move, as they had no chance of playing in Saturday competitions because of it being a work day. Utterly devoted to Abbeydale and to golf, Dr. Husband was regarded as another leader who made things happen at all levels in the sport. For the first few years at the Beechief site, the club rented a room at the nearby hotel and used that as its headquarters. But by 1906 it had its own wooden clubhouse situated within the grounds of the hotel. Right from the beginning, the club had high regard for its lady members, and they were allocated their own area within the building. However, there was a prominent notice reminding them that small-heeled shoes should not be worn for fear of damaging the greens. Golf was now within the reach of more and more people, and it was reported that by July 1910 membership had reached capacity, with 160 men and 60 lady members, more than enough for a 9-hole course. So, for the first time, a waiting list was introduced. Meanwhile, the committee considered the financial pros and cons of extending the course to a full 18. Agreement was eventually reached with the existing landowner to rent a further but adjacent 44 acres, this time to the east of Beechief Drive. Once again, the club sought out a top man to design what was to become the new 9 holes. On this occasion they went for Herbert Fowler, whose fine debut course, Walton Heath, had put him in great demand. The conversion of the newly acquired pastures into a viable second 9 holes was completed very quickly indeed. So much so that a grand exhibition match to mark the course's expansion was able to be held as early as October of that year. James Braid and Harry Varden, huge stars of their time, were engaged to play a match against the professionals from the Abbeydale and Hallamshire clubs. Over 600 spectators paid to watch, and the club made a decent profit after payment of all the expenses. Note the high proportion of women watching, perhaps confirming the good health of ladies' golf at that time. By 1914, golf in general was riding on the crest of a wave, with Abbeydale in particular enjoying its growing reputation. The committee was confident enough to hold its very first open meeting and was swamped with over 400 applications. This was a 3-day affair with separate competitions for men, ladies and mixed. A limit of 8 handicap had to be set for the men's event in order to keep the numbers manageable. The magnificent but expensive Abbeydale Amateur Cup was the trophy of that day, being won on its first outing by a Sicklehome member. Regrettably, that occasion in June 1914 was the last time for 6 years that the trophy was played for in open competition. Things were about to change massively. Dark clouds, which had been ominous for some time, suddenly went black, and the so-called war to end all wars started in August. Abbeydale's hugely successful Grand Open meeting, like so many happy and glorious English summer sporting events, became a thing of the past. Many optimists were confident that the Kaiser's army would be defeated by Christmas. In reality, nothing could have been further from the truth. It went on for more than 4 crippling years. The whole dreadful conflict changed millions of lives worldwide forever. Although of a lesser consequence, the war also came very close to shutting down Abbeydale Golf Club, and others like it, through lack of numbers and income. Regular attempts to raise money to keep going made little difference. It became very much a hand-to-mouth situation. As month followed month and year followed year, the club's financial situation went from very bad to critical. But the hard core of the membership were finally shaken into action in 1917 when the bank proposed that the club should be wound up, and as quickly as possible. The threat of losing their beloved club unified those remaining members like never before. Many who'd previously resigned rejoined and paid up. People dug deeply into their pockets, and very quickly £1,000 came in. That's about £120,000 in today's money. The corner had been turned, but my goodness, it was a close-run thing. After hostilities ceased and the war ended, membership numbers at Abbeydale started to grow again. There was an overwhelming sense of freedom and renewal amongst those who'd survived the war. What's more, the course at Beechief eventually went back to 18 holes, the Ministry of Food finally returning the areas which it had borrowed for growing crops. The piece of video we're seeing now was shot in 1999 and has never been shown in public before. John Furness, who is the author of the club's centenary book, is recalling the Beechief era with a former member at that location. He's George Nunn, who was just short of 100 at the time of that recording.
It's amazing to me that this is the 80th anniversary, isn't it, of when you joined Abbeydale? 1919?
It is.
Why did you go to Abbeydale?
Well, because my father joined.
Yeah.
Now, my father had a car parked during the war, during the 14-18 war, which I started driving in 1919. He didn't drive, and he wanted me to drive him up to the golf club, which I did. I went round with him, more or less caddied for him, and hit a few balls, and he made me a member in the June, I think it was, of 1919.
Yeah.
And the entrance to the pro shop was about 30 yards lower down, Abbey Lane, and that was the entrance for cars. There was only room for about 4, of which my father's was one.
How many clubs did you start with, can you remember?
Yes, 4.
What were they?
They cost about 7 and 6 each. I had 2 woods, a driver and a buffy. I had more than 4. I had a mid-iron, a mashie, a niblick and a putter. And there's 5. And they were in my locker over one Christmas. I didn't see them from the beginning of December until the middle of January. I went to get them and they'd been pinched. I don't know whether they're insured, but I know I had to get myself a new set. My father bought me a new set for about a £5. They lasted me for quite a long time.
You may recall that the subtitle of our presentation today is Characters and Heroes. We've already introduced you to several people of great renown who meet those criteria. But before moving on from the club's Beechief era, we should not overlook Henry Hall Bedford, who was the club's president for 18 years. During the early 20th century, Mr. Bedford was a dynamo of a man. His energy and skills were of huge value to many and varied organisations within the Sheffield area. Industry-wise, he inherited and then expanded his father's company, which made tools from iron and steel, and was credited with developing the modern adjustable spanner. He travelled worldwide by ship and by train to promote the company's products. And this is Mr. Bedford in full colour, thanks to the board which ran the Sheffield Infirmary. Henry was their chairman for many years, and they commissioned a portrait for the occasion of his retirement. This was in gratitude for his inspired leadership and years of service. But that's not all. He was also a much valued director of the Sheffield Banking Company. And in 1907 he was appointed Master Cutler. Neither should we forget that he sat on the magistrate's bench on a regular basis too. In addition to all these things, he was a keen golfer, not only playing when time allowed, but also presiding over and influencing board meetings at Abbeydale, something he did through some very turbulent years. When you consider all the different responsibilities which Henry took on throughout his life, you have to be amazed at his resilience, his stamina and sense of purpose. Abbeydale certainly benefited from all of his skills. Abbeydale has a wonderful range of trophies, of all shapes and sizes. It's something one would expect from a club well into its second century. But this scene is in complete contrast to the earliest days of golf, when silverware as a prize was a rarity. In those bygone days, a trophy was usually donated by a wealthy member, and to win one was very special indeed. This handsome specimen is Abbeydale's oldest survivor, from 1902. The curious thing is that it has two identities. On one side it is named the Challenge Cup. However, turn it around through 180 degrees and it becomes the Duncan Barber Cup. Fortunately, the explanation is pretty straightforward. Any confusion is all down to this man, Albert Duncan Barber, a solicitor by profession, but a highly competitive golfer too. Research into club competition rules in an early handbook reveals that if you won the same trophy twice, you could keep it in perpetuity. Mr. Duncan Barber did just that, winning the Challenge Cup in 1907 and 1911. Therefore, the club had to buy this replacement in time for the next season. However, by the 1920s, Albert had kindly donated what must have been his best ever prize back to the club in order to create a new competition. This was to be open only to members of at least 10 years standing, and that is how the cup is titled. However, and over time, it's come to be more commonly known by the name of its generous donor. It would seem that golf clubs have always been generous to competition winners, possibly because the odds of oneself actually winning on the day are fairly small. These days, the original expensive trophies are normally on display, but kept under lock and key. However, miniature mementos like these, to take home and show off, can bring the winner a happy reminder of being top of the list once in a while. Henry Gomm, who was in his golfing prime during the first 30 years of the 20th century, had a habit of being a winner on a very regular basis. His family has kept safe many of his winning mementos, like these, for more than 100 years. Each bears his name and the year of the win. The one shown here is scaled down to about 1/8 actual size. This is a sample of the many medals which Henry won. He sometimes gifted them to his daughters. Gold chains would be added, and hey presto, his girls often wore them as pendant necklaces. Where prizes are concerned, new eras bring different ideas. Here we have a medals final prize from 1932. This most attractive piece is 9-carat gold plated. As you see, it is engraved with the winner's name. Unfortunately, we've learned nothing about Mr. Newton so far. However, we are most grateful to one of our current members who bought it for the club's memorabilia collection. It came from an antiques dealer in Suffolk, and we welcome it as another valuable part of our history. When Evelyn Sermon joined the club in 1919 as a young mother, there was no clue as to the influence she would bring to the ladies section during the next 50-odd years. Once her children had matured, she immersed herself into the work of the ladies section, improving standards both on and off the course. A charismatic and very popular person, by 1932 she had been elected Lady Captain. From what we understand, Mrs. Sermon was always regarded as very correct in all that she said or did. She was clearly a leader and always aimed to set a good example to others. But besides that, she was a caring person. This applied both to the ladies that she led and to the welfare of the golf club itself. In return, and at all times, she did expect everyone to meet the standards of discipline, smartness and dress which she had set for herself.
When I joined the club, she was virtually running the ladies section, inspecting their shoes, clothing, and if anybody stepped out of line, you got the verbal disapproval of Evelyn Sermon.
I remember Evelyn Sermon very, very well indeed.
Yeah. We never dare call her Evelyn at Abbeydale.
No, she was always Mrs.
Sermon. That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, last time I saw her in the bar, and I went across to her. I said, "Mrs. Sermon," went up and kissed her. And she
that deserved a medal.
She was really surprised.
Yeah.
But she recognised me.
Yeah, yes. Well, she was a sort of mother superior
Absolutely,
of our ladies
yes.
section.
Yeah, she was secretary for years and years, wasn't she?
Even into her 80s, Mrs. Sermon was still taking responsibility for most of the tasks on the ladies' committee. But eventually, she was finally persuaded to step down and accept the specially created and unique office of President of the Ladies Section. Evelyn lived to the ripe old age of 94 and is commemorated with 2 superb trophies. Apart from the golf course and an occasional house, the majority of Beechief Estate was farmland. It was a massive area, and all 700 acres of it came up for sale in the early part of 1922. In simple terms, it stretched from Abbey Lane, Bocking Lane, and all the way down to Twentywell Lane. Quick off the mark to purchase it was a Sheffield estate agent and developer, Councillor Frank Crawshaw, and as such he became the golf club's new landlord. The Great War was now over and the population was starting to grow again. Mr. Crawshaw anticipated that Sheffield would need to expand gradually into the countryside, and it would be necessary to build hundreds of new homes. It was a long-term project, and for him to take it on was a bit of a surprise, as he was already 62 years old. Mr. Crawshaw advised the golf club that when it came time to start building, the golf course at Beechief would have to be sacrificed first. After all, and this should ring a bell, it was in a prime location, being next to a major road and a railway station. However, he did offer to sell to the club 111 acres of excellent golfing land beyond Beechief Hall, at the southern end of the estate. The golf club, for its part, truly loved the idea of owning its own course, rather than being a tenant. But how on earth were they going to raise the cash to make that happen? It would need a supreme effort, because the club was still in deficit from the effects of the Great War. For comparison, if they were to buy the land in today's money, design and construct the course, build a clubhouse and lay down a road, it would easily cost in excess of £1 million. For the club to form a limited company and sell shares would seem to be the quickest way of raising the money, and that's the option they took. And here is one of the original debenture certificates. The scheme was a success, the take-up being excellent from both club members and others, partly because of the promised interest rate of 6%. However, because of over-optimistic estimates and rising costs, it became necessary to borrow extra money commercially, both from private sources and from the bank. Despite this, all was well in the end, and the scheme got the go-ahead. The huge irony about all of this upheaval is that the course at Beechief, which Abbeydale had occupied for only 28 years, was not, in the end, used for housing at all. Mr. Crawshaw sold it to the Sheffield Corporation as a pay and play course for use by the general public. The Abbey and associated buildings were gifted by him to the city. Here's a second look at the aerial photograph from 1928, looking eastwards, which shows the new course and the farmland beyond, before houses were built. Bringing things right up to date now, this is what it looks like today. Plenty of green space and not overcrowded. Because of the tall trees on the periphery and the up and down nature of the land, the golf course cannot be seen from the houses, and vice versa. Abbeydale appears to be sitting comfortably and naturally here. What's more, it's quietly at arm's length from the outside world. It may surprise you to learn that the course wasn't always tree-lined like this. In a moment, we'll go backwards to the summer of 1924, when it was first opened, to see how differently the course looked at that time. The new course was largely designed by Herbert Fowler, whose reputation had deservedly grown in stature from when his services were previously employed at Beechief. During this period, he had taken into partnership Tom Simpson, who himself was to become world-renowned for creating classic courses. It was usual during this golden age of the 1920s to incorporate 5 par 3s and 5 par 5s into most designs, and that's exactly how things were organised at Abbeydale. Many followers of golf course architecture think that Fowler and Simpson should be given equal credit for the success of Abbeydale's unique holes and flowing layout. As the new course began to take shape during 1923, there was an excited anticipation in Yorkshire golfing circles. The Sheffield Daily Telegraph, when given a tour of the partially completed site, was overflowing with praise.
Here is spaciousness indeed, and loveliness too. Almost the whole area is fringed with beautiful woodland, the remote, calm sort of thing, which makes you wonder if you really are within a mile or two of Sheffield highways.
In comparison with the Abbeydale of today, the original layout was a wide-open moorland course. There were just a few mature trees of oak and conifer, so strips of rough were used to separate the fairways. It wasn't until the mid-1960s that thousands more trees were introduced to better define the fairways and soften the appearance of the course. In terms of a new greenkeeper, Abbeydale had an unexpected coup in the build-up to the opening date. Messrs Fowler and Simpson persuaded the head man at a top course in France to come to Sheffield and take charge. There's no photograph as yet, but our new and highly qualified man was Walter Troughton. He came from Baron de Rothschild's exclusive course near Paris. A fairly low-key opening ceremony for Abbeydale's new home was held on the 28th of June 1924, when a foursomes match over 10 holes was contested. The first tee shot was struck by the 77-year-old president, Henry Hall Bedford. It was a deserved honour after successfully steering the club through some very thin times. Unfortunately, the posh new clubhouse was causing problems. Indecision over the design and construction, not to mention the lack of budget control, it caused huge delays. Only a part of the building was usable on the big day. But after the honeymoon period, and once on stream, everything started to feel and look better, both on and off the course. Even the finances were improving, and by 1928 the club finally showed a credit balance for the first time since before the war. In those early days, when the only way to cross the Atlantic was by ship, it was quite common for the American pro golfers, like Walter Hagen here, to stay on in the UK after their visit to the Open Championship. In order to recover their travel costs, they would then go on to play a number of lucrative exhibition matches. These were held all over the country, their opponents being leading local amateurs. Crowds were always plentiful and enthusiastic. In July 1933, Abbeydale were asked, with only 1 week's notice, if they could accommodate such a match. The directors were eager to accept and were even more delighted when they discovered that one guest would be the one and only Walter Hagen, the ultimate showman and the best golfer in the world at that time. His playing partner would be Denny Shute, who had just, in the previous week, won the Open Championship at St Andrews. Even if it was for only one day, this event was going to lift Abbeydale's profile to new heights. Spectator numbers was the key to a financial success, so the good news was quickly sent out to the local press. Including sixpence in tax, admission was going to be 3 shillings. That's more than £25 in today's values. There is no record of the final attendance, but the club took no chances and engaged 100 stewards and asked for a dozen policemen to help keep control. Playing in a 4-ball format, the Americans easily won their match against 2 of Sheffield's leading scratch amateurs, Banks and Cowley. Their nervousness at being in such company was said to be a factor. Remarkably, and never having seen the course before, Walter Hagen went round in 68 shots. Local newspapers at around that time, besides writing a conventional sports report, would send a cartoonist to make his own witty observations. This international occasion was a resounding success, a notable day in Abbeydale's story. The event cast a long shadow, which without doubt benefited the club's profile. Agreeing to stage the match in the first place was also typical of the club's buoyant mood and confident outlook. Always be bold and seek the best. Right from the very beginning, starting at Rycroft Farm in 1895, it's been a fascinating tale of fully committed members who have loved and nurtured the golf club. Although those pioneers who helped it to grow have now passed on, it's not the end of the story. If you think about it, every aspect of life is one long cycle of regeneration. It works over and over again, year after year. That's the fantastic miracle of nature. And just as everything which grows on our course renews itself every spring and grows strong, so too will each generation of new members. Instinctively, we know that they will push on ahead with the same enthusiasm and loyalty as those before them, to ensure stability and growth for Abbeydale for all the years to come.